will get the show on the road because I know we have only 1 hour and folks would continue to join us. So welcome to another presentation from the People's Cultures and Careers Research Cluster at James Cook University in Singapore. My name is Ed Ng. I'm your host for today's webinar on getting qualitative papers published with Professors Pauline Stetton and Paula O'Kane. I'm a professor of OB, Organizational Behavior, and I lead the People's Cultures and Careers Research Center here at JCU Business School in Singapore. We are a vibrant and diverse group of scholars engaged in research on people, work, and organizations. If you wish to collaborate with any of us, please feel free to reach out. You can check us out on the JCU Singapore website. Erica will post a website link for you on the chat. So most of cited and impactful articles in top journals are oftentimes based on qualitative data and analysis. But qualitative researchers often reflect upon running the gauntlet when they try to get their studies published. This results in fewer qualitative manuscripts being accepted. Oftentimes, reviewers also don't understand qualitative data and attempt to apply concepts of generalizability and validity and reliability to qualitative studies. This is problematic when the underlying epistemological as well as ontological assumptions are quite different. Additionally, in my own experience, authors do not explicitly address issues of transparency and trustworthiness in their submissions, especially with the data process, or adequately describe their data collection and, more importantly, analytical processes. So I have called upon two friends and colleagues to offer us guidance for both authors and reviewers so we can inspire more submissions, write clearer methods sections, and ultimately ensure more qualitative studies being accepted in our journals. Let me first introduce you to our guest today. First off, my co-conspirator and co-editor-in-chief, sorry, I'm a bit tongue-tied there, Professor Pauline Stetton. She's an honorary professor of management at RMIT University in Melbourne, Australia. She almost needs no introduction. Some of you already know her really well. She has held many leadership positions in 3 universities, including the roles of Dean, Deputy Dean, Head of School, Deputy Pro Vice Chancellor, Business International. I almost ended up in Australia because of Pauline. She had offered me a job, 10 years ago. She's an active researcher and has published qualitative work in top-tier HR and industrial relations journals. All right, next we also have Pauline O'Kane. She is a senior lecturer in HRM at the University of Otago in Dunedin, New Zealand. Beautiful part of the world. I visited her, I think about 10 years ago too. Her research interests lie in strategic HRM and performance management. She also researches and teaches qualitative methods. Paula has a particular interest in the role of computer-aided qualitative data analysis software. This is what I'm here for. In supporting rigorous interpretive research, she has also published in top-tier HRM and methods journals. She is currently an associate editor with us at Personnel Review and also previously an associate editor with the Journal of Management and Organization, as well as Leadership and Organizational Development Journal. So there are lots of editorial experience here today. So please join me in welcoming them to today's webinar. So a big round of applause. Now, before we begin, there are a few housekeeping items that I want to share with you. Today's webinar will be recorded for publicity purposes. It will be made available on the website that Erica just posted for you, roughly in about 2 weeks' time. You will be able to ask questions at any point of the webinar through the Q&A function. So please do, and I do encourage that. There is a Q&A at the end of the presentation. So what you need to do is simply post your question on chat. And of course, depending on how many questions we have, I get to pick which questions to be posed to our panelists today. Also, Erica reminds me there will be a satisfaction poll and survey at the end of the webinar. Please take 2 minutes. I promise you it actually just takes a minute to complete the survey. Your feedback is really important to help us improve and bring topics that are of interest to you. And of course, if you encounter any technical issues, please use the chat button and you will be able to communicate with our event organizers, Erica here. So I'm going to step off now and let Paula take over. Both Paula and Pauline will alternate in their presentations, and I will step back in when it's time for the Q&A. Paula, the mic is yours.
Kia ora koutou. Thank you, Eri. I'm just going to bring my screen up hopefully now and you can see our slides. Just give me 1 second. There we go. So kia ora, everyone. Lovely to have you join us all today. I'm going to start just with a very quick introduction to why we put this webinar together. And then I'm going to hand over to Pauline and we're going to sort of do a wee bit of a double act because it's something that we're both very interested in and that we really want to work together in helping people to publish their qualitative work. So this is the sort of challenges that we see as editor and associate editor on journals whenever people try to get their qualitative work published. So the first key thing, and Pauline will talk to you more about this, is making sure that we have a really strong theoretical contribution. That's the beauty of qualitative research. So we want to make sure that we can really pull that theoretical contribution through. In terms of how we actually present the research that we've done and the rigor of the research that we've done, we can see that we can have some issues around transparency and trustworthiness within our research design, within our analysis, and within how we present our results. And so really what we want to encourage qualitative researchers to do is what a term I've heard a few times recently from my qualitative colleagues is this idea of on-silencing, making sure that we're able to give voice to all of the actions of the qualitative researcher. And in that sense, being true to your data, and if it's participants, to your participants in the research. So really trying to give a very transparent view of how qualitative research has evolved and how your research project has evolved. And in that sense, where we see a lot of the conversation happening at the minute is this idea of challenging the status quo of templates. So trying to say, actually, what did you do? What's the actual story of your data collection and analysis rather than retrofitting it to templates? But we also know there are challenges around word counts in journals. And I've just recently seen that Human Resource Management Journal has increased its word count, I think specifically for qualitative articles to allow for some of those word count limitations. So we have to learn to be very strategic in how we write about our data analysis and our results, but also making it very concise, but representing that data. So really what we want to give you some hints on, to talk to you about, is this idea of really representing qualitative inquiry, giving it a real voice to our qualitative inquiry, and ensuring that we communicate to our readers all of the decisions that we made whenever we undertook the qualitative research. And then in doing so, as we always do in journal articles, making sure that we communicate the potential impact of the research. So those are the challenges, and hopefully we'll talk through each of these in a little bit more detail as we move through. So I'm just going to hand over to Pauline to start with, and she's going to begin our content.
Thank you very much, Paula. I'm actually coming in today, joining you from Jarrah country, Jarrah Wurrung country, which is in the Macedon Ranges, just north of Melbourne in Australia. And I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of Jarrah country on where I live at the moment. So I thought I'd start off with the bigger picture, thinking about, what is your research, what is your paper actually about? And just thinking a little bit about the aims, objectives, and research questions, and how you link your research design to the research and to what it is you're trying to do. So when I think about aim, I usually think is what is it that the research is trying to achieve? At the end of the day, what is it that you want to have done? So I've done a lot of work in the health sector. I've done a lot of work on strategic human resource management, particularly in the Australian health sector, particularly in Australian hospitals. So that is probably my aim of a lot of the work that I do, which is to examine strategic human resource management in that particular context. So when I think about objectives, I think about, well, what is it that I do that helps me achieve that aim? So, for example, many of the papers that I've written around strategic human resource management in the Australian public health sector will have different parts of it. So we will have a literature review which looks at strategic human resource management generally. Then it will say something about how research has into human resource management has developed in the health sector. And then it will also look at the context in terms of Australia. And from that kind of background, thinking about the aims, thinking about the objectives, then the next key question is, well, what's the research problem? And that's the research questions. And in qualitative research, the idea of the research problem is really important. Often in quantitative research, we think of a gap in the literature. In qualitative research, what is the phenomena we want to investigate? And then we think, okay, well, how will the research design, the method, the sample, how will that enable the research problem to be addressed? So moving along onto the next slide, Paula. Thank you. So when we think about method and research design, we often think about, well, what did we do? We often think about data collection. But we've also got to think very early on about how we analyze that data. So Paula talked about the importance of theoretical contribution. You won't get published in a good journal unless you've got a contribution. So right at the very beginning, you've got to think about, what that is. Papers that only focus on the what and the how are largely descriptive, and that they rarely cast light on why this research problem is a problem. So what we need in qualitative research is an analytical framework that's a lens through which you can look at the problem and give insight into the phenomena. And there might be different aspects of that. You might bring in a number of different lenses to use to cast light on that phenomena. So next slide, please. How do you do that? How do you identify your analytical framework? So in quantitative research, you've got to do that really before any survey is carried out. You know that, the scales need to be justified. Any potential relationships between variables need to be thought through. The literature review has to be tight. So in qualitative research, it is a little bit different. You will start off with a literature review, as I said before, in the terms of the research that I do in the public health sector. That literature review helps you identify the problem. However, in qualitative research, the process itself is iterative and it's often exploratory. So once you get underway with the research process, themes often emerge from the data that you actually didn't consider in your original review. And so you need to then start thinking again, and you need to then develop your analytical framework. So to give you an example of that, I do quite a lot of work with Indigenous scholars. And at the moment, one of my Indigenous PhD students started out his study with three key areas to look at: social identity theory, employee voice, and also Indigenous perspectives, Indigenous standpoint theory. But in the process of doing his research, he's identified how Indigenous leadership is actually a key area. So he's had to go back and start to have a look at all of that. So moving along. The other thing that we need to think about, and sometimes scholars really struggle with this, is the idea of research philosophy and linking the design to the research philosophy. We all have a research philosophy, even if we don't realize we do. And it's very much about our assumptions of the world. And often we use these very long, scary words about ontology, epistemology, perhaps praxis or method. And we've got some quotes here about phenomenology and how that could be used. I think an easy way of thinking about this, to me, ontology is ways of being. Epistemology is ways of knowing, and method or praxis is ways of doing. So when we do qualitative research, it's really important to be aware of our own biases and assumptions and the way we view the world. But it's also important to think about our participants in our research and the way they might view the world. And so the little sort of section that we've got here, which talks about phenomenology, is actually about trying to understand the way that people interpret the world and the way they see their perspectives on the phenomena. So a qualitative researcher, we have a more interpretive view of the world. And that impacts on our research design, how we capture those different views and how we compare them and how we look at them. And it's reflected in the language that we use. So we're very keen on words like transparency, where we're demonstrating what we've done. We're very keen on words like rigor rather than science, that we can demonstrate that we've done some of the right things, and the trustworthiness of our data. Because in qualitative research, we're often talking about exploration. And that's one of the real values of that research. Next slide, please. Now, also linked to philosophy is linking our research design to context. And we often find papers that come to us and there's very little context. So if we take a phenomenological approach to our research and we want to understand not only the way we see the world, but the way other people see the world, our participants, then we have to understand the context in which they live and work. So a clear context does bring the paper to life, and it allows us to interpret the data within that context and discuss what that might mean. So context can be varied. It might be country. So different countries have different histories and political systems, different cultures, all of which will influence the way people see the world in that country. Different sectors. I do a lot of work, as I said before, in the health sector, very different from manufacturing. So what happens in that sector is important. And also whether or not in the health sector, are you looking at private hospitals? Are you looking at public hospitals? Different drivers in each context. Organizations are contextual. Different drivers for different organizations. And then different phenomena. For example, climate change. You can look at the phenomenal approaches in that. All of those things are important when we're thinking about qualitative research. Next slide, please. I think it's over to you, Paula.
Got it. Thank you, Pauline. So I think just to add to what Pauline was talking about in terms of the importance of context and really making sure that we bring that into how we write. And I think that's part of what we really want you to have a think about today is whenever you come to write your qualitative submissions, trying to get that context in, trying to make sure that you stay true to the research philosophy and that terminology that you use in the way that you communicate to your reader what you've actually done. And we see this a lot whenever we're looking at reviewing papers. And I often, when I'm doing an initial review as an associate editor, will make some notes about the method whenever I'm doing that quick review before I send it out for a full review, so I can give the submitters or the authors some feedback on getting some of those core parts into the method. So I'm just going to talk a little bit more about this concept of method transparency. And really all I mean is being really clear about what you did and why you did it. And Aquinas catches it really nicely. It's the degree of detail and disclosure about the steps, the decisions, and those judgment calls that you make. And that is really important in a qualitative research project, whether it's a judgment call about your context, whether it's a judgment call about your sample. Why did you choose that sample? Why is that context important to the phenomena that we are looking at? What did you actually do? So try and lead the reader through a journey of the actual stages and the core decisions that you made. So taking them through your thinking, and your best tool for that is actually keeping really, really good researcher diary. So writing down everything that you've done. So when you come to write up your method section, that you remember all those steps. Because I think with a qualitative piece of work, there's often a lot of steps and they don't stay the same. They change from each piece of research to the next piece of research. They depend on the colleagues that you're working with. They depend on the people or that you're talking to if you're doing interviews or focus groups or have primary data collection. So you're trying to lead the reader through the actual stages and the actual decisions that you made. And I think we've seen a special issue in organizational research methods recently that's looked at the concept of templates. And what we are trying to say to researchers and to authors is that it's not that templates are wrong. Templates can be a good guide to help us through the research process. So we're thinking of templates like Eisenhardt's or the Goya method. They can be really useful. But what we are moving away from, and I think there was a lot of this if we went back 5 or 10 years ago, was retrofitting our results or our analysis into these sort of 3-stage templates. And now we really want you to bring to life the stages that you actually did. That's your transparency, that's your rigor. That's really giving people a really strong sense of how you actually did that qualitative data collection and analysis. And then as you do that, the why. Why did you do it that way? How does that enable your research question to be addressed? Why was that the right way to do it for the context that you had? So you start to see all these pieces of your jigsaw actually coming together to create a really nice impression of your research to your reader. So one element of this is our sample transparency. So in qualitative research, our samples tend to be non-probability samples, but what we want to think about whenever we're writing about our sample is what was the population that we had to choose from? Are they the right people? That's the key thing. Will they allow us to address the research question, address the phenomena? And thinking that numbers are not always representative. So just because you had 50 interviews doesn't mean that that's better than someone who had 10 interviews. It depends on what was needed to address the research question. And again, saying, well, why is this sample makeup the right people to talk to when we're doing our research? And we often talk about data saturation, or we can refer to some of the guidance articles that have been published, for example, the Saunders and Townsend article in 2016. And those can be really useful tools to help us think about the number of interviews that we might want to conduct, for example. But it's not always just about saturation. Again, it can be about having the right people and having a real depth of data that you collect and justifying that whenever you write your paper. That can be around insightfulness, it can be around in-depthness of the data that we're trying to get across. But if we do use the lens of data saturation, be really clear about how saturation was achieved, at what point it was achieved, what were you seeing or not seeing in the data that allowed you to say, actually, we've collected enough data. We don't need to do any more. There's nothing really new coming through in that data. So keep that nice and clear. Again, whenever we're thinking about sampling, there's often hierarchies of sampling. So it might be that you're saying we are collecting data from a particular country. So the example in the article from Personnel Review that was up earlier was from the Philippines. So why is the Philippines the right place to collect this data and answer the research question? If it's organizational research, why is this organization a good place to collect it? Doesn't necessarily mean that another organization wouldn't have been useful as well, but why will this one allow your research question to be answered? Thinking about then the people, if you have different groups of people that you want to talk to, be very clear about why you're talking to office workers versus non-office workers, or whether you're talking to managers versus employees, and how that again enables you to answer that research question. And part of what we do whenever we're thinking about our data is to consider the concept of triangulation, but being aware that we can use triangulation to compare groups of people in our sample. So it doesn't always have to be about 3 different types of data. It can be different groups of people and comparing across them. So we might compare the attitudes of different levels in an organizational context. And this is where I actually haven't talked very much about computer-aided qualitative data analysis in this presentation, but there is a little technique called a matrix coding query, which can allow you to very quickly compare across groups, and that's available in most of the Cactus tools. So that often gives a level of depth in your analysis that you might not get if you were doing it by hand, and allows you to see it in different ways. And again, as part of that transparency, think about how your sample selection might impact the results, and talk about that in the results. Because again, sample selections aren't always perfect. Sometimes they're the sample that we can actually get access to. And then what role does that play in how you interpret your results? So we go from, I've got our sort of our broad method, and then we've got our sampling, and then we want to think about the transparency of our analysis. And this can be really tricky to do as well. So going back to this idea of trying not to retrofit it onto the templates in those 3 stages, what we're trying to do is really move from those research questions to uncovering what the really important themes are in our data. And you might be going from a very explorative, very inductive type piece of research where you're letting the data speak to you, to a more deductive piece of research where we start to see the same themes coming up time and time again. Or it could be vice versa. You might be starting with more of a framework and looking to support that framework, but it often becomes a little bit explorative as well. There's lots of different ways that you can analyze your data. And again, you want to stay true to what works for you and what works for the data. But we know that coding is one of the most common things that people talk about. So we want you to, again, think about how you've analysed your data and why you've analysed it in that way. Some other ways that we talk about in the research that we're doing are things like chronology, so how things changed over time, visual maps, lists. They are what has been talked about in the literature as analytical artifacts. They are ideas and ways of looking at your data that allow you to move from that raw data right through to your final theorizing about your topic. And again, we're thinking very much about iterating all the time. So when I do qualitative analysis, I will go through my data numerous times. I'll go through my themes numerous times. We'll look for those connections. I have my whiteboards going all the time. Things change. I talk to people. My ideas change again. And so all of that's actually quite hard to capture and to communicate. So we're trying to sort of potentially pick key points in time that we can talk about where we saw a big change in our data. And this I have borrowed from a friend of mine, Anne Smith at Tennessee, and this is her analogy, so I don't claim it at all. And Anne's actually just joined the Academy of Management Review as their specialist in qualitative papers, and she has said it's quite a big job. So she talks about this idea of the brushes and how you might talk about your coding initially. And she talks about a big, a medium, and a smaller brush. And so in the big brush, you might start some of your analysis by breaking up your transcripts, for example, into interview questions, or you might start more with your existing frameworks and look for chunks of text in the data that allow you to support those existing frameworks, or you might start very much at that in vivo type code. So those words or phrases that really jump out at you that make you think, actually, this is really interesting. So think of a piece of work of ours where we were talking to HR business partners and managers. And one of the things that somebody talked about was the polo effect. And the polo is a mint in the UK. I think it's called a lifesaver in the US. I'm not sure if we've got the equivalent in Australia or New Zealand, but basically it's a lolly or a sweet with a hole in the middle of it, and it's called a polo. And so somebody talked about the polo effect, and that became actually one of our key themes in that piece of research, because it really spoke to things getting lost down the hole. And the words of the participants really came through on that. So we're sort of trying to communicate what way we started, how we started big or small, and how we evolved over time. And really trying to tell your story, tell the story of the data and tell the story of the data analysis to the reader. So this is just an example from a paper that we published this year. So what we were trying to do is to really expose our analysis. And you can see here that we talk about things like coding moments. And coding moments are what we sort of talk about as our aha moments. You know, what are the things that hit you? And it's from, I think it's from Locke and all 2022, who just sort of say, whenever we're listening and we're reading and we're talking and we're going through our transcripts or going through our data, what are the things that suddenly hit you? And those coding moments are really, really exciting, but we also can capture them whenever we talk about our analysis. And so what we see with the analysis that we did is we just talk about having all the discussions we had and how we got together and when we got together and what changed when we got together, and tried to make a real narrative out of it to really expose that analysis process and step our reader through the coding that we did. Why they developed, what were the changes, why did the changes happen? Sometimes it was a matter of going back to the literature and evolving our coding again, giving examples of some of the key codes at each stage. So at the initial coding stage, we had 52 codes. Here are some examples of them. Then we went back and we looked at them again and we connected them together, and we ended up with 10 key themes, and we one of the themes was made up of these 3 codes, or we discarded this code. So you're just trying to give the reader a real flavor of that thinking that went on. And if you used any of those Cactus tools, what techniques did you use? What did you learn? And what did it enable you to do? We've got another paper that we're sort of working on at the moment, and it's about talking about the disconnect between talking about using Cactus software and the analysis process. And quite often people will say, we use Cactus, here's what we did in our analysis, but they don't connect and weave the two things together. And that's where the real strength lies, is pulling those two ideas together. So if you used Cactus, how did you use it? At what stage in your coding process? What changes happened afterwards? What did it reveal? And this is just to give you an example from a paper from 2017. Ignore this first table. This is us going back, what's that, 7 years ago, so probably 8 or 9 years ago, realistically, when we wrote this, and we retrofitted into the nice 3 stages because that's what we were asked to do, and that's what the reviewers asked us to do. But we are trying to expose how things evolved over time in our research. And so we used figures. This is the final figure over here on the right-hand side, but there were probably 20 figures before that that we used to help our thinking. And so having those visuals can be part of those analytical artifacts. And we're looking at the idea of coming up with sort of key themes. And in doing so, we're reducing our data and we're trying to display our data in a way that really communicates our message to our reader. But again, you're not going to do this first off. It takes quite a lot of time. And we all, as we worked together, there were 3 or 4 of us on this paper, and we used a lot of our own interpretation and conversations and discussions to really get to our model at the end of it all. And so I think it's that time, and then how do we capture all of those decisions that we made in the process that we're trying to expose. This is a much more recent paper from HRMJ that we got accepted, I think this year or late last year. And what we were trying to do here is to expose some of those core points whenever our thinking changed. And so you can see we go through here and we talk about, look, first stage was inductive coding, 3 authors did it. Here's some of our sample initial themes, or it could have been called codes. Here's our first model. We presented it at a conference. We got lots of feedback, lots of discussions. We then went in and we did it in a different way, went back to the literature. We identified and classified tensions. We haven't thought about the tensions before. We presented it at another conference, and there was lots of thinking in between. And then we got feedback at that conference, and they suggested we use paradox theory. So we went back to the literature and we researched paradox theory, and we integrated paradox theory into that literature review. And then we ended up with our final iteration of the paper. And so this was our attempt to communicate how our iteration evolved over time. I will say, just going back to this paper, which was another paper in the same topic, I did something similar with that and submitted it with the paper, showing how our model had evolved over time. And in the first round of reviews, nobody commented on it. So I didn't get a positive, I didn't get a negative, I just got a nothing from the reviewers. So I chickened out because people weren't really doing this. And I removed it from the second round of reviews. And so nobody mentioned that it was removed, and it never ended up in the published article. But in the paper in 2024, we put it in and we thought we're just trying to really communicate what we did. So just showing you that. And just finally from me, just going back really to what Pauline said previously, we are thinking really nicely about what do we do whenever we uncover new findings. As they emerge and they evolve, then we might need to go back into the literature. So I just wanted to give you an example here of the personnel review article that we published last year on performance management. And really, this is the last paragraph from our introduction. And what we said is, in our introduction, to help to really set up the scene of how things happened, that the analysis of our discussions with HR practitioners led to what Locke et al. Described as that coding moment. By putting the patterns of coding together, we revealed from the HR practitioner's perspective the importance of conversations, and that sent us back to the literature to look at social exchange theory. So we're being really upfront with how we changed over time. And I'll just hand back over to Pauline now.
Okay, thanks, Paula. So this comes to the point where, okay, how do I write this paper? You know, I've got heaps of data, heaps of it. And anybody who's done interviews knows that you might start off with the interview schedule, but, you know, your interviewees go off into all sorts of different directions. And so you end up with a whole lot of themes, codes, ideas. How do you actually turn that into a paper? So I think the first thing to remember is that there actually might be more than one paper in your research. You know, you don't have to put everything into one paper. And that's something that I've certainly learned over time in many of the projects that I've been on, that you can actually slice and dice. But how do you actually do this? And this is why your analytical framework is really important. and how you change your themes or your codes or your ideas. How do you translate those into actual findings and then into a discussion that's of a quality to get into a good journal? So themes will cover, a general area of key issues, but findings are much more specific. So one thing that I usually sort of encourage my PhD students to think about, and it's something that I do when I'm also analysing data, is to think about what have you found that confirms the literature? Okay, so you've got your analytical framework, you've got your different literatures that you've drawn on, you know what the cutting edge ideas are in those different literatures. And, you might have come up with themes that have made you go back to investigate another literature. So what have you found in your data that basically says, yeah, it's the same as such a body over here? What have you found that contradicts the literature? What have you found that's different from the literature? Because that's important. That's a very important finding. And what have you found that's new that extends the literature? Because here you start to come on with your theoretical contribution, the difference, the so what question. And what have you found that isn't in your literature review? I said, how does your analytical framework help you explain your findings? Have you had to add anything to your analytical framework? That is entirely fine. And so what? What have you found? Why is this important? What is your theoretical contribution? What is different from what you found to what's been said before? Because that's what's going to get you published. So moving along, Paula, to give an example.
Right. Yeah.
So this is a paper that myself, and I think a lot of you will know Tim Bartram, who's done a lot of publishing in this area. So this was a project that we did right through the 2000s, and it's an example of iterative research and analytical framework. So we got this paper published in the International Journal of Human Resource Management. We called it Singing the Same Song. It was about translating human resource messages across the management hierarchy in Australian hospitals. So we'd started out with we were looking at strategic HRM in Australian hospitals. We'd done a big survey and we found this industry survey. There were lots of different approaches to understandings of what strategic HRM actually was. So we were lucky enough to be able to find 3 case study hospitals that were interested in working with us. And in those hospitals, we did a whole lot of interviews with different managerial levels, from the CEO and the senior executives to the middle managers, line managers, and also system practitioners, and we did some focus groups. And what we ended up with was a lot more than just looking at strategic HRM. What we ended up with was actually an understanding of the strength of the HR system. So we can go on to the next slide. I'll show you how we did this. We'd originally been sort of playing around with the high performance systems literature, but it didn't kind of really work with the kind of data that we had. But we found Bowen and Ostrov's analytical framework on components of strong HRM systems. So this was a paper that was written in 2004, published in the Academy of Management Journal. And Bowen and Ostrom have done this meta-analysis of all of the literature on strategic HRM and high-performance work systems. And then they'd kind of boiled it down to key issues, which they talked about the strength of the HR system. And they identified it under the 3 key areas of distinctiveness, consistency, and consensus. So distinctiveness is a system in terms of, is it visible? Is it understandable? Does it have legitimacy of authority? Is it relevant? Is that how people see it? Consistency was about the instrumentality. If I do this, is this the reward? The validity of the processes, and the consistent HR messages that come through the organization. And by consensus, it's about agreement between the principal HRM decision makers, transparency, fairness, and equity. So we applied that lens to our data, and we found that it gave us real insight to what was taking place in these 3 organizations. So we found differences in terms of distinctiveness, in terms of the HR system in those 3 organizations. We find a lot of differences in terms of consistency and a lot of differences in terms of consensus. And this helped us ask the why questions, the so what question. That paper's had a lot of citations. So moving along, Paula. Then we have to think about, well, how do we structure this paper? And there's no one way of structuring qualitative data. There's no one way of doing it, except I would say never have your findings in the front end of the paper. And I have seen that for papers. Don't do that. Always make sure you've got your findings and your discussion in the second half of the paper after you've done your method and you've talked about your method. So there's different ways of doing it. So for example, in the paper that I'm referring to, we actually separated out the findings from the discussion. So we actually told the story of HR in those 3 case study organizations. And then we had a discussion which we went into the literature and we discussed our key findings against the literature. But some papers aren't structured like that. I've also written papers and seen many papers where the finding, the discussion are together. It's fine. It's what makes sense, and it's what makes it easy for the reviewers to read in the first instance, but also you want your paper cited. So you want not only to get published, you actually want people to read your paper and to find it useful and to cite your paper when they're coming to write their papers, because that's what's important for academics. So in terms of writing this up, what you've got to make sure is that you're applying your analytical framework to your discussion and your findings, and very clear then on what your theoretical contribution is, because that is what people will cite and that is what will make the difference to you. So moving along quickly, I think we're now onto the last slide, and then we'll open it for questions and discussion. The final bit of any paper is the practical and policy implications. So if you've contextualized your study, then you will have a good chance of writing something interesting about the importance of that context. And that might be something about government policies or organizational policies and practices. Because we find as editors that this section is often one of the weakest. And I can't tell you how many papers I've written where the practical implications are people need to be trained. HR managers need to be trained. HR managers need to train managers. I tell you, as an ex-dean, head of school, experienced manager, I am not impressed being constantly being told I need to be trained. Okay, just not impressed by that. Sometimes training is important, but often what people need is support. And often what people need is perhaps some policy change. So think about your practical and policy implications from that contextual perspective. Don't just fall into the easy answer. And the other thing is, one of the benefits of qualitative research is that usually we'll have engagement with our stakeholders, because we've usually had to meet people and get into organizations, talk to a whole range of people, from our HR directors to CEOs to professionals. Those are our stakeholders. We have an opportunity to then ask them, what's the impact of the research? What do they think the implications are for our research? And all of that enriches our data. And that is something that we often don't do enough of. And yet, why did we even get into a case study in the first place? Why were we even invited into an organization? How did we even find those people that we've interviewed in the first place? Let's ask them, what do they think are the main impact of our research? What do they think our implications are? So I think that's the slides covered. I don't think we've got any more slides apart from the reference list. We've given you some good ideas to think about how you might get published, and we're happy to take some questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Pauline and Paula. We scheduled this for 40 minutes, but I feel like we almost need 4 hours. I personally appreciated you both walking us through with some examples. Now, I've got a list of questions here. This is Q&A. If you have a question, please post them on the Q&A. I will pick those that have the most relevance to what was just discussed at the moment, so that we'll have an opportunity to ask both Paula and Pauline to offer their guidance and advice. The first question, I'm going to direct this to Pauline. The question here is, what would constitute a theoretical contribution in the context of qualitative research?
Okay, well, that's a good question, because that's often what examiners, reviewers are actually looking for. So remember the three questions that I suggested? What is it? What have you found that, that confirms the literature? If you've only found stuff that confirms the literature, you're probably not likely to be able to make a theoretical contribution. But what have you found that's in contradiction with the literature? That's at odds with the literature. And why do you think that's the case? So if you've got good context here, if you've explained your method well, if you've really you looked at the people that you've interviewed or the focus groups that you've held, that should give you some insight into those differences. And that will be a key theoretical contribution. It's that insight that the literature gives you on the phenomena that you've investigated. Similarly, if you find stuff that nobody else has talked about, that the literature doesn't mention, okay, you need to ask the question, well, why is that the case? What is it about this particular study that casts light on why that's the case? That's your theoretical contribution. You're extending the literature. You're adding to the literature. You're saying something new. You're saying something different, or you're arguing with something. You're saying, well, that's only relevant in certain areas. If you look over here, it's something else is important.
Great. Thank you, Pauline. All right, Paula, the next one is directed. I'm going to direct this to you. How would you justify in a research paper if the sample is only from a single organization? And this is especially true when the study is actually being commissioned. So the data comes from a single source. Is this an issue in qualitative research? 1 minute.
No. So I think the key thing is going back to that research question and that context. So make sure that the organization that you use enables the research question to be answered, explain why collecting data and that organization allows it to be answered. And then whenever you go into your findings and discussion, bring that context into your findings and discussion, because that could be nice and unique within itself. So actually take advantage of it if you can. There's something unique about it, something really nice. Maybe it's a public sector when most research was done in private sector. Maybe it's a different industry, different types of people that work there. So answer your research question and acknowledge and use that context in your discussion and findings.
Excellent, nice and concise. I have a follow-up question based on what you just said. So from both your presentations, I hear a lot about emphasizing research transparency. Where did the data come from? How did you collect the data? Your sampling, on and on. My question for you is this: is it possible to replicate, given the question that we have on hand here, from a single organization? There's a lot of context to this. Is it possible to replicate qualitative research?
In the sense of conducting it again?
Yes.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. I mean, I would suggest you can follow the same research design, but I'm not convinced that you're going to come up with exactly the same findings. I think you'll find similar findings, and you might actually find nice, new and unique findings. So that's that exploration that comes with qualitative research, and that's that context. So replicability isn't really something we discuss strongly in qualitative research. Pauline?
Yeah, look, I absolutely agree. I think I can't even say the word. I think it's a very scientific concept. That you do a study, a scientific study, and I think it does come from the physical sciences. You study in a test tube, and then can you replicate that somewhere else? And do you see the same growth of the same organisms? And that's really important in that kind of scientific research. But I think for qualitative research, that's not what we're trying to do. We're not trying to come up with science. We're trying to look at phenomena, and we're trying to understand what's happening. So we're like lifting up the bonnet of the car and having a look what's going on and seeing what fits together and what doesn't. Now we might get some general, sort of ideas from there. If this doesn't fit with that, the car's not going to go. But apart from that, there'll be a whole lot of other things that we might see that we can then we can ask those questions in different contexts, which then might give us some more insight into those different contexts. So it's not about, trying to prove stuff. That's not what we're doing. We're trying to understand the world and interpret the world.
Thank you for that. It's clearly showing my really quant bias here. So that's a really good answer. All right, Pauline, this one is for you. What about reflexivity? How much should we explain or acknowledge our perspectives? And this is particularly true. I have done a couple of orthoethnography. I can't even spell it for the life of me. But I feel like that is me storytelling. And I introduce a lot of biases in it, but I also understand from an epistemology perspective to, sort of the how we know things. Certain instruments that are sort of crafted by others may not necessarily be able to tap into the lived experience, right? So tell me if this is an issue at all.
I love this question. I think I said before that I've been doing research now with some Indigenous colleagues for quite a few years now. And so lived experience and understanding different perspectives and the kind of reflective side, I think is really, really important. Now, can you get it published? Well, funnily enough, we did get a paper published in the Australian Journal of Management last year. And this was actually a paper which reflected on the journey of an Indigenous PhD student. And what was interesting was when he did his confirmation of candidature originally, and he talked about some of the difficulties he'd faced on his research journey with the ethics process, with presenting at a conference, etc., and some of the assumptions that had been made and some of the racism he'd faced. One of the people on the panel at the time said, well, why don't you write that up and make that part of your PhD? So we had 3 or 4 instances of where he'd really faced some significant overt and covert racism. So myself and another supervisor, the other supervisor, an Indigenous supervisor, and Mark, we wrote our variations of those stories. So we told how we felt about those 3 different situations, and we couched it in if you like, ethnography, and we told the stories, and then we pulled it together. And it's an A journal. It had a lot of interest in that paper. But the way we did it, we identified the problem of racism against for Aboriginal people in Australia. That's the problem. The context was universities and academia. Then we told it. Then we did a bit of a thing on ethnography. Then we told the stories from the 3 different perspectives, and we were upfront about our 3 different perspectives. And then we had a discussion where we analysed what had actually taken place against the literature. So yes, it can be done. And I think there's more interest now in that kind of research where the researcher puts themselves in the story and is transparent and upfront and recognises what they're doing.
I think also
Great.
to add to that on a slightly sort of, I want to say, simpler level, I know we've done papers with colleagues in different fields. One we published in Futures, and I came from a HR perspective, and another colleague came from a sustainability perspective, and someone else from an Indigenous perspective. And actually, we acknowledged our 3 different perspectives in the analysis process and talked about how that helped us see things in different ways and actually reach a story that was way more interesting because those 3 different perspectives had actually come in. So it was just a small part of the analysis to help the readers see where we were coming from. And the other people could have taken our data and actually put another lens on it, which I think ties nicely back to what Pauline was saying about multiple papers. multiple papers from the same data can actually come from those multiple lenses and multiple ways of thinking that we have as researchers, and from our multiple different knowledges that we bring.
Okay, thank you for that. Now, I've got 2 or 3 questions about the word length. And we get this very often, especially with journals imposing word limits of 8,000 words. So the questions I have, and I'm going to get Paula to answer this as well. How do you deal with the challenges of word count, especially when journals actually impose 8,000 words? It fits quantitative research really nicely, but with qualitative work and the amount of description we have to offer from a methods perspective, how do you deal with this?
I think there's a couple of things. I do think some journals are getting better at recognizing that. And we saw the example of HRMJ increasing their word lengths for qualitative papers. I think the other part that we are trying to do, particularly with the computer-aided qualitative data analysis, is to provide more language that you can use that reflects what you've done, so that you can create more conciseness in representing the research that you have done, particularly in the method and analysis part of it. So think and then using more of our visuals and our diagrams that can help to communicate our message in a quicker way. But it is a challenge, and I face the same challenge. And I have a colleague, and he sends me a paper, and I'm like, I'm sorry, Martin, you got to lose 3/4 of that quote. And he's like, I love it, Paula, though the depth is gone. I went, hard luck, it's gone. I've got to take it out. I think the first sentence says enough. Got to leave it at that. So I know that some people are talking about giving opportunities for online appendices that can potentially give us maybe a quotes table that add richness to the data, and we talk more about it from a themes perspective in the findings section. So there are different ways of dealing with it, but it's certainly a challenge.
Great, thank you. All right, another one that I have that's really important to address as well. This is for Pauline. A while ago, you mentioned about, you have so much data and it's so rich. And instead of trying to fit everything into a single paper, you might be looking at multiple papers here, right? Is it okay to actually publish multiple papers or write multiple papers out of the same data set? Do you have to disclose that to the journals? And more importantly, sometimes I may be forced to use certain quotes more than once. Is that okay?
Look, generally speaking, I would not use quotes more than once. I don't know. I don't think there's any rule about that, but that's my rule. I only use the quotes once. I have to say I've never disclosed because they're always different papers. They're not the same papers. You're looking at the data from a different perspective. So we did a big study on lean management in healthcare a few years ago, and we were both in Canada and in Australia. And we must have got about 8 different papers from that. So that included a couple of literature reviews on different aspects, So one was on HR on quality of care, one was on HR and lean. It included a particular study on one hospital and the data from that hospital on a particular and it was around work intensification or work engagement. So it was really looking at what lean was doing there. It included a paper on the union reaction to the introduction of lean, and it included a paper which was looking at the doctors' reactions, what doctors had done in that. So they were all different papers. So although they all had a lean story to them, they all drew on different data. So we had something like 144 interviews. So it drew on different data and it told a different story. So I think that's the key thing, is you're telling different stories. You might be using the same data or data set, but you're pulling different things out of that data. You don't have to put everything in one paper. It would have been impossible. So, and you're telling better stories because you are pulling some data out, for example, the union story, and then you can have a literature review which backs up that, which leads to that narrative. And so you can actually say something. So I don't know if that answers your question, but you're telling different stories using the same data set, but not necessarily the same data. You see what I'm saying?
Okay, that's a good one. Okay, one last question. This has been asked more than once as well. So a lot of top tier journals are now looking at multiple studies, and oftentimes with qualitative research, you only just have that one study, and oftentimes it may come from a single source, a single organization. So we hear a lot about mixed methods. Is that necessary to get into top tier publications? Any one of you can answer that. Both of you can answer that, and then I'll close. I have to bring this to a close. We are past 10 o'clock.
Go, Pauline.
I was going to say it's not necessary. I've certainly had a mixed methods paper in the Journal of Advanced Nursing, which is a top journal. One of the big things about mixed methods is word count. It's difficult enough to get a qualitative study into 8,000 words. If you've got to get a qual and a quant into 8,000 words, that's even more challenging. I've done it, but it's challenging. I don't think you have to do it now.
I think there is more acceptance, and I sort of point to to a colleague being appointed as the qualitative editor in Academy of Management Journal, and that's for that precise reason, to bring qualitative expertise into the journal, so that the reviewers don't necessarily have to have the qualitative expertise. She will advise the reviewers from the qualitative potential of the paper. So we're seeing more and more journals sort of think that actually we can have single study qualitative papers in there and value them. So I agree, it can be hard and some reviewers can be funny, but I think the journals are working really hard to make it much more acceptable, which it should be.
Great, thank you. We have a lot more questions. Unfortunately, we are out of time, so we will actually collect all these questions and we'll do our best to respond to them, either electronically or we'll post some of them on the website that Erica had shared earlier. Well, Pauline and Paula, thank you so much for sharing your insights on engaging in qualitative research. It's always delightful to listen to you both. I really appreciate you taking the time to come to speak to all of us. The other thing I want to mention is before I bring this webinar to a close, I want to put a plug on our next webinar from the People's Cultures and Careers Research Cluster. So last year, you may recall we had to postpone another presentation by Kathleen Park from Boston University. Kathleen was supposed to speak to us on surviving the maze, unpacking diversity in the migrant hierarchy in the elite migrant journey in the global south. This is an interesting presentation. I've heard her speak on this before, which is why I invited her here. This is essentially west to east migration and south to south migration, which goes counter to the migration patterns that we have been accustomed to, which is east to west and south to north. And of course, with that kind of migration or reverse pattern migration, we see a lot of stress as well as a lot of status that accompanies a lot of west to east migration and south to south migration. Unfortunately, we don't have a time and date confirmed at this point, but please do keep your eyes or ears peeled for announcements that will come to your inboxes. And if you want a recording of today's presentation, you can check back in a couple of weeks by visiting the JCU Singapore website or the Research Cluster website. Thank you again for spending your time with us today. Erica had posted a satisfaction survey. I would appreciate it if you can take a minute to complete the survey. It's really helpful for us as we do our programming and see what topics you'd like to listen or sort of participate in. Be well, wishing everyone a great week ahead. Once again, to my panelists, Pauline and Paula, thank you very much.